Welcome to another session of the Rewiring Your Brain Summit. I'm Ron Siegel, a clinical psychologist at Harvard Medical School in the USA, and I'll be your co-host for this session. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Arielle Schwartz, a psychologist, author, and trauma treatment specialist. Welcome, Arielle.
Thank you, Ron. It's lovely to be here with you.
Thanks so much for joining the summit. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And first, I'd like to tell our audience a little bit about your background for those who might not be familiar with your work. So, Dr. Arielle Schwartz is a clinical psychologist and a leading voice in the healing of trauma. She's an internationally sought-out teacher and author of 8 books, including the Complex PTSD Workbook, the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook, EMDR Therapy and Somatic Psychology, and Applied Polyvagal Theory in Yoga. As founder of the Center for Resilience-Informed Therapy, she offers a mind-body approach to therapy for trauma and informational mental health and wellness updates through her writing, public speaking, social media presence, and blog. She believes that the journey of trauma recovery is an awakening of the spiritual heart, which is to my mind, a wonderful way to frame this work. So again, thank you so much for being with us. And I thought we might start by pulling back a little bit and looking at what trauma is. Many people speak of trauma, but how do you understand it most broadly?
Yeah. Well, I like that you asked the question most broadly, because for me, I'm going to borrow from Judith Herman for a moment and just speak about this core definition, which is that trauma is anything that overwhelms our sensory capacity to adapt to our experience. And so when we are taking in the world around us, we are ideally allowing the kinds of experiences that we have to be integrated into our overall sense of self. And as a result, they don't stand out or take over or overwhelm the mind or our emotional capacity. But trauma is different. Trauma is either one event or an accumulation of life events that disrupts that integration capacity, where we don't feel like we know what to do with that thing that happened or those events that happened. How do I make sense of those events and incorporate them into my overall sense of self? So we can get into nuances of memory consolidation and how events get held in the brain and the body. But overall, when I look at just our sense of being in the world, can I metabolize what happened to me? Can I digest it? Can I incorporate it into my sense of who I am in a way that creates this kind of coherent narrative? I know who I am. I know what's happened to me, how it shapes me as a person, how it shapes my reactions to others. And those are such key, essential ingredients of that integration of an event. So trauma overwhelms that capacity, yeah?
Yeah, I really like that way of looking at it. And it occurs to me as you're talking about it, I can imagine there being a kind of ratio between the intensity of an experience for us personally, for whatever reason, and our capacity at the moment to do this kind of integration. Sometimes we can control what happens to us. Sometimes, of course, we can't. But maybe there are things we can do about, in some way, fortifying that capacity to bear it. Is that consistent with the way you look at this?
Yeah, very much so. And I love that you use the word control in this, because that's another key element to a traumatic event, is that we don't have control over those events happening, right? They happen outside of our self-agency in a sense. It's something that happens to us that we didn't choose. And so when we're looking at trauma recovery, we want to reclaim a capacity that I have agency now, that I have agency to reach for the kinds of supports that will help me, that I can access to those resources. When we look at a resilient person, it isn't so much that I basically have been able to kind of pull myself up by my bootstraps my whole life, although sometimes that's what helps someone cope well, but it's really more about our access to the people that help us process the events around us, especially when those events started in childhood, right? Did that child have someone to go to talk about the hard stuff, and someone who listened to them, who validated their emotions, who helped you understand yourself in relationship to what occurred, and to know that there's a route back to a sense of safety and connection. So when we don't have that on top of an event, it's like a double whammy. And now I can carry sometimes into adulthood a sense that I still don't have choice. I still don't have agency. I don't have control. And a lot of the work that I feel like is central to trauma recovery is reclaiming some of those factors so we can build in the actions that we can take, the access to caring and compassionate people. We can discover how to turn towards the felt experience and our emotions now in a way that's more with more capability, with more capaciousness to be with those strong experiences and not feeling quite so overwhelmed. So we, in a sense, put the client back in the driver's seat of their lives.
Yeah, you're talking about something interesting that I'm not sure clinicians always put together, because you're simultaneously talking about having the experience of what we usually call an organized attachment experience, but being able to have caregivers when we're young who, when we're in distress, can in some way soothe and comfort us, and we can connect with them and we can get safety. And also the sense of agency, which is interesting, right? Which is, and you're really talking about having the agency to find others that we can connect with and get a sense of safety. So it makes me think, do you think kids, when they're having a more or less secure attachment experience as a child, are developing a sense of agency at the same time?
Yes, I really do think so. And I think if we look at the converse of the impact of the loss of agency, when a child internalizes that there's nothing I can do to change my circumstances, that there's nobody I can turn towards, right? So now there's this loss of self-efficacy from a very root sense of self in the world. My actions don't make a difference, or I don't get the feedback that I'm important enough for somebody else to prioritize. So if we look at secure attachment and as fostering that agency or the lack thereof as perhaps impairing that self-efficacy and self-agency.
Yeah. So again, I'm trying to go back to the mind of the little child or the 18-month-old that so many of the attachment studies are done with. That if I cry or call out and somebody comes, then I have a sense that, hey, I can act in the world to improve things when I'm in distress.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And then when we, as this rolls into adulthood, of course, we carry that 18-month with us in some form or another. We have that inner child who either can, you know, can effectively seek out others in a way that trusts that we can find those others who are sources of nourishment and kindness and care. Or we might carry with us those memories and felt sense that there's nobody there and there's nobody that I can trust. Or maybe people do come toward me, but they're not really safe. And so all of those attachment frames actually show up in us and will be reawakened when we experience something that's destabilizing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. We have such different models of the universe, right, that we carry into each situation, and so many of them are self-perpetuating. If I go about the world assuming people aren't going to be there for me, or worse, they're going to be malevolent in some way, we don't have to get very woo-woo about it. We're going to communicate in such a way that's likely to make people less interested in us and might even make us more vulnerable to folks who are malevolent in some way. But if we go out with the sense that, well, of course I'm lovable, of course I deserve care, of course I would be nice to talk to, and of course you'll understand my pain, we might get very different results.
That's exactly right. And I think, what we're speaking about is the reenactment of traumas. So we have these early templates and then we carry them with us, and then we're likely to repeat. And it's one of the things that I love about the therapeutic relationship is that we have opportunities to work with those attachment templates and to have a new experience in relationship.
Yeah. So one of the things that people who research trauma frequently study is, how can it be that there are two people that are in what seem like rather similar situations? Let's say they're two soldiers in the same unit, side by side, doing something very similar. and experiencing something painful, and one comes back with PTSD and the other doesn't come back with PTSD. I'm guessing that some of the variables that make the difference here are connected to just what you're talking about. But I wonder if you could flesh out your understanding of what are the different factors and forces that bring us to one outcome or another.
Sure. Certainly, some of the factors that we're speaking about right here and now are very related. That sense of self-efficacy and agency, that I have some sense of control, that my actions are going to make a difference in the outcome of my life, right? And that if we like back that up into the actions that I take today are going to make a difference in the outcome of my day. Or in this hour, as I'm interacting with you, the actions that I take are going to produce some kind of wanted effect. Not that I can control everything, but that ultimately, even though big, scary things might happen, I may have been exposed to, combat during military experience, or maybe I experienced a car accident or some kind of relational trauma or natural disaster. If I'm coming out of any kind of trauma with that sense of control and efficacy, I'm more likely to engage in the world in a way that is going to maximize the most beneficial outcome. Whereas if I'm coming out of an experience like that, and I don't have that sense that my actions make a difference, I'm much more likely to isolate myself, to stop trying, to become passive in response to it, to feel helpless in relationship to it. And therefore, I'm not engaging in the strategies that might maximize my resilience.
Yeah. And I wonder how that plays out in the case of what we call moral injury, which is just for people who aren't familiar with the field, which is when we've done something that we feel terrible about having done, and that is part of the trauma. Can you kind of connect that to what you're saying about the importance of agency or self-efficacy?
Sure, it's a really interesting question, and it's something that's kind of leading me to reflect and think, because it's a question I haven't been asked before, and I'm appreciating that.
I didn't think of it until just now when you're talking about this.
Yeah. So in terms of just my surmising and response, the feeling of now again, like I've done something that's um, uh, you know un, that not only do I feel ashamed about, but that somehow is that event something that I can recover from, that there's a redemption around? Or is that something that is fixed or dooming me to some kind of terrible outcome? So, we come back again to some quality of mindset. And I really love the work of Carol Dweck, and I'm sure you're familiar with her work on mindset as well. And this concept that we might come towards our world with this fixed mindset that somehow I am who I am, or we come towards our world with a change mindset that I might have taken actions that I regret, but that I can actually work with that, metabolize, and come out the other side of that having learned something, or having been able to metabolize regret in a way that becomes useful, rather self-flagellating and beating myself up with shame.
Yeah, now I think that's very interesting because I think what was partly behind my question was the observation that sometimes when people are suffering with this kind of moral injury, feeling bad about who they are for what they did in some way, that when they get released from that, it's sort of understanding that, well, what they did was the result of the factors and forces at the time. Let's say the combat vet. Well, I was an 18-year-old kid, scared to death. People were shooting at me. I saw something move. I shot. And then I discovered it was somebody who was innocent, So it's a kind of, it's an interesting understanding that, well, we didn't exactly have agency in that moment, right? That there are all these factors and forces impinging on us. But you're talking about the agency that we would have in realizing that, okay, I've done this, but how can I move on in my life? And how can I recover from this? How can I forgive myself? How can I, productively live, even as sometimes people do after these events, with how can I make it up to the world in some way? That then starts to become where the agency comes in.
Well, what I hear in what you're saying is that these two are quite interconnected in a sense that being able to look at yourself and hold the context of your life at the time that you made that choice is also a source of profound self-compassion, which in itself is a profound change agent, isn't it? Right? Like when we can turn towards ourselves with some kind of acceptance for who I was at the time that I made that decision, and therefore, I can allow myself to be with that feeling of regret or shame or guilt or whatever is held in that moral injury, and recognize that now is different from then. Maybe now I would make a different choice. And you said something else really important in there, which is also a factor, I believe, of resilience, which is how can I take meaningful action in my life now, even in relationship to something in the past that either happened to me or that I imparted on someone else. And that sense of meaningful action now gives us a sense of purpose and meaning for our future.
Yeah. And since this conversation is happening in the context of this Rewiring Your Brain Summit, it occurs to me that it's interesting that in the apparently rather successful use of MDMA for PTSD in the studies, the variable that seemed to really predict people getting relief from the MDMA, from the PTSD symptoms, was an increase in self-compassion. That, just as you're saying, that when they were able to see themselves in a different light and hold themselves warmly, well, that changed the whole ballgame for them.
Yeah. If you were to ask me what do I think is maybe the most important factor in all kinds of recovery, whether that's trauma or any other mental health symptom, I think that self-compassion is one of the, the top two, right?
Yeah, yeah. Having been involved in teaching the integration of mindfulness practices into psychotherapy for a real long time, in the early days of this, we were very interested in paying attention carefully, noticing the patterns of the mind, developing acceptance, but acceptance for pain and the courage to move toward things. And as the field has matured, the finding a way to be kind to ourselves in the process has emerged as a super important part of it.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
So you specialize in a mind-body approach. Can you say a little bit more about to complex trauma in particular? And I think you were talking to us about complex trauma, but you may not have labeled it as such. Can you tell us something more about what exactly complex trauma is and how it differs from simpler forms of trauma?
Sure. So, as you named, I made reference to it earlier, and really what we're speaking about with complex PTSD or CPTSD is the impact of ongoing repeated events. And they don't always start in childhood. They might occur later in life, but they often are relational in nature, and that they accumulate sometimes in rather subtle ways, and sometimes it's the accumulation of many, many significant events. So it can be either, but they inform our sense of self. So in addition to the primary categories of symptoms of PTSD, which are re-experiencing symptoms, or nightmares or flashbacks, and we also have avoidance symptoms, the urge to avoid being around something that might remind me of the trauma. And we have hypervigilance or heightened arousal symptoms, but we also have three more categories of symptoms, and they're emotional dysregulation, that it's much harder for me to navigate the emotional waves of my life experience. We also see greater interpersonal problems where it's harder for me to develop consistent forms of relational nourishment and support, and going back to the attachment pieces we were speaking about. And then the third additional category would be kind of difficulties in my self-concept, so that my overall sense of self is disrupted, and maybe there's greater likelihood for dissociative symptoms or fragmentation of self that make it harder to feel a cohesive sense of self.
Mm. So when you're thinking of complex trauma, are you thinking only of bad things that are done to us, or are you also thinking about what we maybe needed but didn't get? In other words, errors of not just commission, but omission.
Omission, right, right. I love that you brought that question in because it can be either. It could be both, right? Sometimes it's both what happened to us and it's also what didn't happen. I didn't have that consistent source of nourishment, or I didn't feel like I belonged, right? Like those subtle layers of feeling like growing up in a household where there just wasn't enough attention paid. There wasn't enough feeling that I was important in the home, or somehow feeling exiled in that home, or that there was just a lack of safety. So we have the neglect side of the picture, and we can also sometimes see the abuse side of the picture.
Yeah. And would you put things like racial trauma, where people have just experienced through their whole life discrimination or rejection? Would you see that as a kind of complex trauma also?
Absolutely. So we have racialized trauma and discrimination, and the experience that not only do I as a person not have a place in society, I've been betrayed by my country, perhaps I've been betrayed by my community, and that can also go back generations. So sometimes we have what happened to me as a person, but that other kind of invisible threads in the complex PTSD picture might be generational trauma, collective traumas that happened to large groups of people that impact me and my family system and my ancestors and the generations that came before me, and so they're also impacting my sense of self in the world.
Yeah, thank you. And since you've developed really an integrated toolkit of mind body approaches, what drew you, and maybe at what point in your career did you realize this wasn't just going to be about talking, that the body played a big role?
Yeah. So I think that part of it came from my own life experience as a person and growing up in a family where I experienced the impact of very early strife in my family and generational trauma and etc. But the experience of my own fragmentation and struggles with that. And that it was through embodiment experiences for myself that I had some of my deepest and most profound feelings of what I would call coming home to myself.
Mm.
I also grew up being exposed to yoga and really developed a daily practice by the time I was 20, and have now had a daily practice for over 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the experiences of embodiment and dropping into a felt experience of where movement could take me into both an emotional release or a somatic release, but also into a felt sense in relationship to my body being held by gravity, that there was something that could hold me and that I could find myself there. That woke up something really deep in my curiosity in my early 20s. I had those experiences both on the yoga mat and in body mind centering classes. And so I devoted my work in the world to really understanding, why does embodiment help evoke this, both from the perspective of releasing and healing, but also a cohesive sense of self. And how can we integrate that into maybe more, kind of talk therapies or traditional psychotherapy, and into the healing of trauma?
Yeah, it's always so interesting to me that yoga is a spiritual discipline, and there's this kind of question of, well, how could stretching be spiritual practice, to say it in a very oversimplified way? And it makes me think of Wilhelm Reich, who was the originator of this idea of character armor, who noticed that whenever we defend against anything, we seem to do it by tightening, by constricting in some way, and basically blocking out experience or blocking out parts of ourselves. So I wonder what you think of the idea that the way that stretching became a spiritual discipline is that when we do the opposite of constricting, when we stretch and open the body, it actually is about relaxing defenses and ultimately letting in and finding a way to integrate all that we've pushed out of awareness. I often see it that way. I'm just curious if you do.
Yeah. I have a few thoughts on that. One is that we're not always just stretching and opening in yoga, right? Like sometimes in yoga, what we do first is we actually follow the constriction and we amplify it so that we get to deeply respect why our body's been protecting us in the way that it has.
Mm-hmm.
So we go toward the constriction. And then just like if you're doing progressive muscle relaxation, when you can feel in your body the purpose of the constriction, or you can wrap your mind around awareness of the holding, then it becomes easier to let it go.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this beautiful juxtaposition in yoga where we actually have very engaging practices in which we're tightening the muscles in order to then be able to release into that stretch. The other response that I have to your question is that yoga is, in its ideal sense, an eight-limbed tree, right? So that it's not just the asana or the physical practice of yoga, but that it's also the breath work, right? It's also the pranayama and the ways in which the breath is going to help free up the prana, or the energy flow through the body. It's going to free up those constrictions around the diaphragm, going back to Wilhelm Reich, and around the chest and around the pelvic floor and the throat and the jaw, so that we have more access to the emotions that might have been constricted underneath those holding patterns. But in addition to the asana and the breath work, we also have kind of moral, ethical principles that involve things like being honest with ourselves, or being able to engage in disciplined practices, or being kind to ourselves, right? Ahimsa, nonviolence. And then we also have the inward turn practices, the pratyahara and the dharana and the dhyana, which allows us to engage in stillness mindfully and being conscious about how we direct our attention, and noticing that sometimes, for example, with trauma, our attention is stuck out there vigilantly tracking the world, and that we can take that precious life force energy and devote that back into yourself as a healing force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really appreciate that sort of differentiated view of it. And in there, the first thing you were talking about, reminded me of all the ways in various psychotherapy systems that we need to first respect the defenses and see why they came about. In Dick Schwartz's Internal Family Systems, a lot of talk about talking first to the protective parts before dealing with the exiles, and even the old ego analytic techniques of, you got to really understand why I've needed to constrict in this way before releasing it. It's very interesting to hear you talk about that as an embodied process of really investigating
Yes.
the holding in that way.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things that I find really fascinating is to be inclusive of internal family systems, or IFS, on the yoga mat, in that we can actually dialogue with parts through the body and explore that, holding in the jaw, or the bracing in the chest, or in the hips, as a part of us.
Yeah.
And that, as we attend to and appreciate the role of even that protection in the body, then we can get in touch with the exiled emotions that are underneath that.
Yeah. So you call your work resilience-informed therapy, and I have some intuitions as to why that is from what you've shared. But how did you come upon that particular way to frame it, and how did that evolve?
Well, so I started out training in somatics in 1996, and somatics lends itself so well, these body-centered psychotherapies lend themselves so well to trauma treatment. And so right from the beginning, as I was doing my master's degree initially, I was learning the practices that were ultimately beneficial for trauma-informed treatment. And then I trained in EMDR in 2001, and I took all of that into my doctoral studies, really exploring how these mind-body approaches are beneficial for the treatment of trauma. And as a trauma-informed therapist, one of the skills that we, to some degree appropriately gain, is to be able to hone in on what's wrong, where are the wounds, what was the worst part of that trauma, how did that impact you, what are the beliefs that are connected to that worst experience. And what I started to experience is that as we put the lens of awareness only on what was wrong, that at the end of the session for a client, or at the end of the day after seeing multiple clients, not only did the client start to feel hyper aware of what was wrong, but me as the clinician, I started to just be kind of weighed down, feeling quite burdened by only looking at the struggle, the pain, the awfulness of it all. And so a resilience informed approach broadens that lens so that it doesn't mean we dismiss the trauma or that we discount in any way the problematic aspects, but that we also learn how to broaden the lens to the strengths that already exist, to what is right, to what is true, to how that person has already survived, to who are the resources that they have relied upon that have helped them get here today. And when we broaden that lens in the resilience informed approach, I found that clients would leave sessions feeling more hopeful.
Yeah.
And I would end the day feeling more resilient.
Yeah, right. And that takes deliberate effort, right? Because there's this negativity bias that our brains have that was great for survival, to remember all the bad stuff and be vigilant to make sure it doesn't happen again, and not to pay too much attention to the good stuff. But it's not very good for happiness and well-being. And I think of both my friend Rick Hansen, who likes to talk about installing the good, right? Trying to actually pay attention to what's positive in our lives, and the opportunity for gratitude, or Diana Fosha, who does trauma work and takes the moments in the therapy session that are kind of good and says, well, let's take a moment and pay attention to this. It really makes a big difference, doesn't it?
It really does. Diana is a friend of mine as well, and we were speaking about some of the parallels of our work recently, and just looking at those moments to catch the upward spiral in a session of that little moment where a client shifts positive quite naturally, or we've kind of guided them there, and then to enhance that, to let that grow, to absorb it. I'm borrowing some of Rick Hansen's language here as well in his HEAL protocol, right? Have a positive experience, enhance it with all of the details, get to know it, absorb it by lingering there, staying there longer. And then there's this beautiful part at the end, the L part of the HEAL in this protocol, which is to link that positive experience to the negative, so that now if we hone in on this rewiring of the brain, we're not just focusing on the negative. We have something to link it to. So we're actually creating new neural pathways.
Yeah. No, and it is so important, because it is so easy to just go with the negativity bias. I mean, I see it in my own consciousness frequently enough, but I can see it in so many people's lives, where the whatever's painful is what garners all the attention, and we can miss out on so many moments worth savoring that way.
That's right. That's right. And so that became kind of the basis of my work, is honing in on those small positive shifts, and then being able to, what I often refer to as a pairing practice, which is that we can build that resource state, we can build that nourishment field, and now we can go in and attend to that wound, and we can start to hold both together, where it's not either or.
Yeah. We're back to this idea of a ratio between the intensity of the challenging experience and our capacity to bear it, that you're talking about a very concrete way that we can enhance our capacity to bear things, right? By actually pouring in the resource of noticing what's good in our lives, noticing what we have in our lives.
Yeah. And sometimes we can't do that for ourselves, and we need somebody else to, in a sense, kind of hold that polarity of the possibility, or a sense of hope, or a sense of, or guide us toward feeling that. And then, in the co-regulating presence of another person, I can rest into that both and together, and ultimately can learn to do that better on my own.
Yeah. I was once talking in a workshop about the arguing with the depressed client paradigm that happens, where somebody's coming in and they're telling the therapist that their life is hopeless, and the therapist is coming up with counter arguments like, well, all you need is one job offer, or one relationship, or trying to say it's not actually hopeless, and the client comes up with better and better arguments, as though in speech and debate club, nailing the argument about how hopeless it is. And somebody raised the possibility of, instead of arguing for hope, suggesting, would you mind if I held a little hope for both of us? Which is what came to mind when you were talking about it happening in the relational context, that we, as the less traumatized member of the pair at the moment, might be able to hold the hope and actually articulate that without forcing it, without arguing about it.
I think that equally important, and I love what you just said, is can I hold the hope for the both of us? And I've used variations of that, but I think equally important, can I help you hold that despair so you're not so alone?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. 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 Yeah. No, so often in therapy, it's when we're finally defeated as therapists, right? And our attempt to, and it's a caricature, but I've fallen into this, the attempt to talk the person out of their misery in some way has failed, and we're sitting in the despair with the other person, and then things can shift.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. It's a really powerful gift to offer that you're not alone with this now.
So I'm very intrigued. In your post-traumatic growth guidebook, you guide your readers through their heroes or heroines journey. And here I'm imagining you're thinking of the kind of the way Joseph Campbell would talk about this in mythology. How is this relevant to personal as well as collective trauma recovery? How do you work with that?
Yeah. Well, I'll start in at the personal, and then we can link it back over to the collective and the transpersonal. But when we experience our trajectory of growth, I think there's something really powerful about seeing it as a quest, right? Like when we watch the movies out there in the world of, whether it's, in search of uh, right, the goblet, the treasure, like we've got these trajectories that we go through in order to find our way to some sense of completion. We respect that there's a journey, that we don't go through that alone, that there's a trajectory of having to face our fears. And in a sense, when we're going through our own trauma recovery, there is a way in which we can have a sense of empowerment to approach that quest towards our own recovery of strength or wisdom or courage as that journey as well. And that it's an inward journey at this point. We're going into the self to confront that darkness, to walk into the cave that we fear to enter, as Joseph Campbell would put it. And there are stages of the hero's journey that really mirror the trauma recovery process. For example, if we think of a phase of innocence, the pre-traumatized time that gets disrupted by the traumatic event, and that sends us into a phase of disorientation, then there is this calling to kind of take ownership of that and to cross the threshold and begin the journey. But very often we reject that calling, right? We do not necessarily want to go into that we don't have the resources yet. So that rejection of the calling actually makes sense. We wouldn't throw ourselves into the fight until we've trained for it. We wouldn't put ourselves into the ring until we've had our allies. And so we take the time to gather our resources and build our healing team. And then when we're ready, we step across that threshold. In the phase where we're not ready yet, we might be drawn into addictions. We might be drawn into distraction. We might be avoiding. We might be isolating. But if we can ultimately have compassion for those strategies and start to build our capacity and our readiness, we cross the threshold. We go into that deeper phase of the descending. And the descending is both kind of mentally turning towards the hard stuff, but it's also descending literally into your body, into the feelings that you have, the sensations, the way the body keeps the score. And to know that we can ultimately feel that and not be taken over by it. It's not going to kill us. We can turn towards something while simultaneously recognizing that it's over now. Hopefully that's the case. It's not always the case, and we can talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
But if indeed the trauma is over, we can work through that now with a enhanced set of resources, and that the treasure that we claim, or that ultimately what we come out with, that chalice, that ring, whatever it is our own wisdom. It's our own strength. It's our own courage. And the next piece of the hero's journey, or the heroine's journey, is ultimately the return. It's where we take that which we've gained in ourselves and we come back to our community, right? We tell the story about it. We dance about it. We get recognized for what we've been through. And we ultimately can make useful what we've suffered into meaningful action. So, watching people that have lost a child create organizations to help other parents who've lost a child, watching people that have, taken their own personal suffering and told their story and ultimately felt empowered to write their book, or whatever that is, right? So our world needs that, because it lays down these breadcrumbs that healing trajectory is possible for me too, right? They did it. Maybe I can do that as well.
Yeah. When you're working with clients around this, do you have them read myths or have them read about these journeys?
Well, in the post-traumatic growth guidebook, I guide them through this as their own journey. And so I don't know so much about having them read myths, but actually writing their own mythology and writing their own hero and heroine's journey. So it's more of a narrative therapy approach that I take. And then ultimately concluding with, what are your gifts to the world, and how do you live in alignment with your values, which I think is very much a part of that.
It's interesting. When I was in graduate school in the early Jurassic period, I remember there was a theorist. I'm not now remembering who it was, but he said you can roughly divide the world's psychotherapies into three baskets. And these three baskets were following Northrop Frye, who was a guy who wrote about literary criticism at the time, different forms of different genres of drama. And this model said that the three there was a kind of the tragic, and that was sort of the psychoanalytic view of early Freud that the goal of psychoanalysis was to transform hysterical misery into ordinary human unhappiness. Not the loftiest of goal, but okay, it was life's hard was that theme. The comic was seen as the kind of a behavioral outlook of, oh, you got a problem, we can fix it, and then you can go and be a happy consumer. And the third was called the romantic, and that was kind of what you're talking about, that everything is, everything's replete with meaning, and we can actually make meaning out of experience by seeing it in larger contexts. And clearly the world's mythologies and the like are ways in which cultures for thousands of years have expressed this feeling of meaning. So as I hear you talk about it, I feel a kind of inspired courage to want to work with it this way. Or, the equivalent happens in sort of meditative circles of everything's a teaching, right? What can I learn from this?
Yes, in fact, that particular quality that you just named of, can I learn from every experience, even difficult ones, is one of the factors that's associated with resilience. Everything's a teaching.
Yeah, yeah. And it is super helpful for people when they're in some kind of very dark space to see it as part of a journey, even if we don't know what the next phase is going to look like.
Yeah. The other argument that I'll make along the lines of what you're saying, which is in relationship to like the World Health Organization's definition of health, and it's not just the absence of illness, but it's the presence of well-being. And as we're moving more towards cultivating states of well-being, which I think are so necessary for our mental health in the world and our emotional and physical health as well, that we need to take the time to cultivate those positive states. And I think, going back to your, the Freudian definition of can we basically just reduce the symptoms so that we can have ordinary unhappiness? As therapists, when that's our end goal and we, okay, we can check that box, symptoms have remitted, and we can send someone on their merry way. What I find is really missing for me as the clinician is that we don't get to see the other side of the equation, which is the thriving side.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, we only actually work with suffering up to baseline. And if we can see that the journey actually can include this final phase of thriving and meaning making, it is so generative. It's such a beautiful phase to witness and to support people to arrive at.
Yeah. And we can see the whole therapy enterprise as part of a spiritual path, that each place that we get stuck in suffering, all of our wounds and the like are all, they're potentially sources of growth and understanding. And you're in Boulder, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who's a teacher that established some institutions there, used to say, neurosis is the manure of Bodhi. And neurosis being a broad term for general psychological suffering, it's the manure, which is both excrement on the one hand, but fertilizer on the other hand, of Bodhi being wisdom. And it certainly seems that way in my life and in the life of people I work with, that it's all these difficulties that actually contribute to inching toward sanity. And that's part of a spiritual path.
Yeah. I think of the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, no mud, no lotus.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, same idea. So your latest book is talks about polyvagal theory and yoga and trauma. And I wonder if you could tell people who aren't so familiar with polyvagal theory, orient us to that, and perhaps share some tools that come from that tradition that you find helpful for working with stressors.
Right. So what is polyvagal theory in a nutshell here, in a very, very brief time? What I'll offer is that it's developed by Dr. Steve Porges. He's been a mentor of mine for about 12 years. And the understanding that the vagus nerve, which is our 10th cranial nerve, one of 12, and the only one that moves beyond the cranium all the way down into the body, serves a very key purpose in the regulation of our autonomic nervous system, in that it helps us navigate states of sympathetic activation back into calm and what we often consider our rest and digest system. When I was first studying the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system got a pretty bad rap. It was basically the cause of all disease, and the parasympathetic nervous system was our relaxation response. And it's a partial truth. But what the polyvagal theory illuminates is that that's not the whole picture, that our sympathetic nervous system is also something that we want to befriend, and that it's actually a very necessary part of the equation of health. If we didn't have our sympathetic nervous system, we wouldn't have play, we wouldn't feel excitement, we wouldn't be able to climb a mountain or go to a dance class or mobilize in a yoga class, right? It's such a necessary part of our well-being. And the parasympathetic nervous system isn't all restorative and nourishing. Polyvagal theory teaches us that there's actually an evolutionarily earlier expression of that parasympathetic system, which takes us beyond rest and digest into collapse, shutdown, and helplessness, withdrawal. And so we can get stuck in a parasympathetic response, just like we can get stuck in the vigilance of the sympathetic system. And so polyvagal theory teaches us that what we ultimately want to reclaim is a healthy balance between the two primary branches of our autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and movement and mobilization in the world, and parasympathetic rest without collapse. And that we also learn that there's kind of a typical tiered response to threat that polyvagal theory teaches us, that we might typically first engage with some kind of threat out in the world by trying to reestablish safety through connection with other people. So we have this upward part of the vagus nerve that Steve Porges coined the social engagement system. And that's very much about our ability to to connect with other people as a source of down-regulating that sympathetic fight-flight response. So now I can connect in proximity for the sake of bonding and nursing and reproduction and feeling loved. And that if we are not able to resolve a stressor with that social engagement system, then we go into our fight-flight. And the third tier in that tiered response is if I can't flee, I can't get away, I can't protect myself, then I might drop into helplessness, collapse, hopelessness, despair. And that part of it, and obviously I could talk about this for hours, but my little nugget that I'll give here is that when we're applying this theory, we can also recognize, where am I on that tiered response to threat? Am I in a parasympathetic shutdown? Am I in sympathetic activation in a threat response? Am I in social engagement? And how can I navigate my way through those states in a way that's going to optimally help me navigate the stressors in my life and relax when it's safe to relax?
Yeah. No, very helpful. And it also sounds like it's very helpful for people to have this map, right? Because so often when we're having some kind of a response, and it could be a fight or flight response where we find ourselves either, just heart racing, or we find ourselves doing something aggressive that later we feel bad about, or even the deer in the headlights response, right, where we're sympathetically aroused but we're frozen and we can't move. People often feel terrible that they didn't do anything, or I think it's sometimes called the mouse in the cat's jaw response, right? The parasympathetic collapse you're talking about, where people also feel terrible about that. Why am I spacing out all the time? Why do I have no energy? Just having this map is so useful for relieving the shame. This loops back to the self-compassion we were talking about. Do you see that in your work, that once people get it, that this is how we and other mammals are wired, they stop punishing themselves so much?
I think it's a huge source of self-compassion, and it also provides a roadmap to recovery. So when we speak about rewiring the brain and rewiring the nervous system or rewiring the body, we actually can find that embedded inside of this whole picture is a path to freedom. It's a path to actually climbing out of those defensive states. And one of those strategies, and there's many, but one is actually what we call accessing the healing power of the vagus nerve, which becomes this kind of mind-body conduit of communication. And that, we spoke about those defensive responses and protective responses to trauma and bracing and somatic guarding before, and that cuts off the communication between the body and the brain. The more somatic tension we hold, the less likely that the brain is going to register, how am I breathing? Where am I holding that tension? Because it becomes kind of background noise. So when we do practices that we call vagal toning, we're actually opening up that communication highway so that the brain can actually receive more of the feedback from the body, and then do a better job helping your body and autonomic nervous system best meet your needs.
Yeah. Thank you. If we have time for one more question that I'd love your thoughts about. We're living in a time, one could argue about which times have been worse than other times. The Middle Ages were no picnic. The Second World War was pretty bad. There have been a lot of times in human history that are very difficult, but I think we could make an argument that at least back in the days of living in bands of 25 to 50 hunter-gatherers, we were exposed to a relatively small stream of traumatic imagery, traumatic information. And now if we pick up our phone or turn on the TV, where, we see horrors throughout the world instantaneously, and that has an effect on our nervous system and our sense of safety. How do you advise people to navigate this, what might be a kind of dynamic tension between wanting to be an informed citizen and not being constantly overwhelmed by this stuff?
Yeah. I love this question quite a bit. And, speaking from someone who is very sensitive, very, very responsive, I have a very responsive nervous system to imagery and to sound. My preference is to read, right? And so we can, or, sometimes to listen to something like NPR. You'll get to know my preferences here quickly. But, if I'm going to read the New York Times or NPR, I'm not going to be overexposed to imagery, and I'm going to actually receive stories through the compassionate voice on the radio. I love the voices of the people that I listen to, right? And so we can choose our news source in a way that's actually regulating for our nervous system. And, I'm also make the choice not to scroll and to take in those images that would be bombarding, because our nervous systems are actually not built to receive that much information that quickly without processing all of those cues of threat. Steve Porges calls it neuroception, but basically our nervous system is going to register those cues of threat whether or not we're consciously aware of it. And so our muscles are twitching, our faces are grimacing, our stomach is curdling. We're having those responses and they accumulate within us. So if you are someone that is prone to watching or scrolling in those ways, make sure that you also have very set times to decompress or digest what those are. For me as a daily meditator, those become very important times to be able to just let my mind filter through and let things go that I no longer need to be hanging on to, or to be noticing what I'm hanging on to so that I can consciously respond to it.
Yeah, it's so hard because the algorithms are very cleverly designed to get us to look at the next horrible thing.
It's so true. Sometimes I'm very aware that I've chosen to look at like puppies and kittens, and so if my social media feeds, give me that back instead of awful scenes, I'm grateful.
Yeah, there you go. And a little tangent here, but you inspire me to think about the disconcerting experience when somebody that I've listened to on NPR, when I see them on television for the first time, and the visual image doesn't exactly fit my often idealized, internalized image from the voice. But you're talking about something very interesting, right? About the social regulation quality of it. And I'm more socially regulated by their voice and my fantasy of what they might look like than I am by seeing them.
Oh, that just makes me laugh. I love that anecdote.
So thank you so much for this wide-ranging discussion. I just love the how many different strands of what we've learned and developed in the psychology field and the world's wisdom traditions you weave together and bring to this such important project of working with trauma, big and small. And if people want to learn more about your work, where would you direct them?
Well, you can find out more about me at my website, which is www.drarielleschwartz.com, drarielleschwartz.com. And I have a second website that is called resilienceinformedtherapy.com, which has lots of resources and classes and profiles some colleagues who work with me at the center. And then I have a YouTube channel, Dr. Arielle Schwartz, which has about 150 to 200 videos to regulate your nervous system. And you can find me on Facebook at Dr. Arielle Schwartz and Instagram at Arielle Schwartz Boulder.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.